Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. For those who don't know, my name is Joe Schrader from OSA, and on behalf of the entire OSA staff, as well as the entire DPI and our partners from DPI, we want to really say thank you for joining us for today's session. So just as we get underway here, just a couple comments. We have over 2,000 members in OSA, and we've been regularly engaging with them throughout the past 6 months. And whenever we do, we ask what the biggest needs are that people need to address. Every single time we poll, every time we try to sample that, the very same need pops up, and is supporting the social, emotional, and mental health of those in that you serve. And so we're here today to address that, because we can't give to others what we first don't have. And so we're so very glad to have our partners from DPI, Liz Krupsak and Molly Herman, who are going to lead us through the webinar today. And they're pulling up the slide deck now as we get underway. Just a couple other comments before we turn the mic to them. One would be that we are recording this session. Hopefully you've seen that in the chat, so no worries. Hopefully you can stay for the whole time and engage and ask for questions as need be, but we will have a recording pushed out here within 24 hours is our aim. And secondly, again, we do have the chat line open for questions. As I mentioned in there, we'll have some time for Q&A as time permits before we adjourn. Okay, I know we're gonna have a little breakout session time here too, a little bit of the way in, so please buckle up, engage, and let's see how we can really create the right conditions, support everyone in a real healthy way for such a challenging time as this. So with that, I want to introduce Liz and Molly from DPI. And Liz, feel free to take us away.
So Molly's actually going to get us started off here in 1 second.
Okay. And here we are. Hi, Molly. Hi, Liz. Thanks for being with us today. Molly or Liz, we can't hear you if you're trying to say something, so just check your mic, please.
We're gonna do it. We're gonna eventually be able to see and hear each other.
There we go.
All right, great. I'll say it again. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be able to share with you a little bit about our Compassion Resilience Toolkit that was developed by Rogers and Health with assistance from the Department of Public Instruction. My role at the Department of Public Instruction is that I'm an education consultant working with the AWARE grant, which is a statewide grant, federal grant that assists 3 particular districts, but hopefully has wider spread than that on assisting districts with school-based mental health. So before I go any farther, I want to give credit to Sue Dix at Rogers and Monica Caldwell at RISE, but formerly of Department of Public Instruction, for the development of the toolkit that we're going to give you a snapshot glance at today. So it was first piloted in schools and nonprofits in 2016-2017 school year, and then launched in 17-18. So it's headed into its 3 or 4 year anniversary of being available for schools. I was lucky enough, though I've been at DPI longer, but coming into this role with the AWARE grant, I was lucky enough to just pick it up when it was post-pilot and post-launch. So it had already had some of the kinks worked out. And I've learned a few things in my relatively short time with Compassion Resilience. which is that it's been a very popular toolkit during the pandemic. In fact, we had a lot of interest during the community of practice calls that we hosted starting in March, April, so much so that we offered a couple of trainings of facilitators over the summer, and they both had waiting lists. So we've been able to spread the word about compassion resilience and how it can be integrated into schools, even during virtual learning or hybrid learning that a lot of districts are finding themselves in. It's also free, so that's a big selling point for compassion resilience, and it's a very flexible model. No one's going to be checking up on if you did, session 2 after session 1, or whether you did it exactly as written. It's intended to be flexible to the circumstances that you all are in, the district that you have, the available time that people have, the frequency that they can meet, all those kinds of things. So really user-friendly in that way. So Liz and I are going to give you a sense of what the toolkit is like, and we're also going to walk you through just a couple of the activities so you can get a little bit of the flavor of what it entails. And while there are trainings of facilitators that are offered, and I'm a person that before I launch a new model of something, I'd love to have a training in it, but even if folks don't and are able to just pick up a couple of the activities with their districts, I think that can be very helpful as well. So I've used the phrase a few times. So what is compassion resilience? So it's really the power to turn to a position of empathy, strength, and hope after just daily witnessing that I'm sure many of you are experiencing of challenges that families face in our community and realities of the workplace. So there were versions of these before, versions of those challenges, and now in the pandemic, we're all dealing with new versions of challenges in addition to all the types of challenges that we faced before. And I guess the shorthand version of what is compassion resilience is really the challenge and opportunity to be optimistic in an imperfect world. I've said this on other webinars that we've provided since I feel like it's a little bit like adding something to the end of every fortune cookie that you read. I keep adding, especially now, when I talk about some of these topics, is that if there was ever a time when we were challenged with what families might be going through, it's especially now in this pandemic. It's things we've never dealt with before, as you all know. So when we think about this idea of resilience in terms of education, we're really talking about educators having the ability to use their energy in productive ways that achieve school goals and meet student needs, even in the face of adversity, or even now. Compassion resilience for those in the education field can look like being physically, emotionally, and mentally well, and compassionately identifying and addressing stressors that are barriers to learning for students. And that identifying and addressing those barriers to caregivers and parents and colleagues really means being able to effectively partner on behalf of children rather than blaming or shaming. And so we can think of this resilience as a bucket of well-being that we can draw upon on difficult days and in difficult situations. And the toolkit we'll be talking about in a moment will explore the protective factors that build and maintain compassion resilience and continually refill that bucket. And we know that research indicates that resilient teachers tend to maintain job satisfaction and commitment to their profession. So if we can focus on compassion resilience, hopefully we can guide staff back to the core set of values and beliefs and that drive and sense of purpose that brought them to education in the first place. Obviously, we would be remiss if we ignored that teaching's a tough job now. It was before, but now it comes with a new set of challenges that folks haven't dealt with before. So that's kind of a little bit of background on what compassion resilience is to begin with. And we're going to turn our attention, at least for a little while, we try to keep this as optimistic as possible, but we're going to talk a little bit about compassion fatigue. So we know that this is an umbrella term for two other terms that we hear a lot: secondary trauma and burnout. So burnout refers to the exhaustion of physical and emotional strength or motivation that happens as a result of prolonged stress related to very high workload, non-supportive work environment, and or feeling that our efforts make really no difference. Secondary trauma, also known as secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, can happen when we come to know the traumatically stressful events that other people are experiencing, in this case, students that we're working with or families. those that are in a position to hear about trauma on a regular basis are particularly susceptible. And unfortunately, that's true for a lot of school staff, that they're having to hear about trauma experienced by their families. So compassion fatigue can be summed up as the feelings of depression, sadness, exhaustion, anxiety, and irritation that may be experienced by people in their work or in their personal lives. I don't know about you all, but the professional and personal are more blurred now than ever, especially since sometimes they're happening in exactly the same setting for those of you that are doing part of your time virtually. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that can look like how could we recognize compassion fatigue, and we're going to do that in a couple different ways. So first, I'd ask folks to just take a moment to type in the chat box an example of what compassion fatigue might look like in practice. What might you see in your colleagues or yourself? What's something that you could notice that would tell you that compassion fatigue might be going on? Let's hope I can find the chat box more efficiently than the unmute button. Good news, I did it. All right. So responses are starting to come in. Resentment, withdrawal, apathy, less patience, more absence, being short with people, no longer listening, blaming those with whom we're supposed to be most compassionate, like students, arriving late, leaving early, joking, sarcasm, just shutting down and being quiet, less understanding of kids and parents, going down a rabbit hole. I think we even hear that phrase a lot more than we used to. Withdrawing, stop fighting for what we believe in, getting pessimistic about students. So clearly, and keep those rolling in, clearly we're seeing a lot of things we don't want to experience, a lot of negative feelings that can wear us down, and in some cases just shutting down our ability to assist, whether it's assisting ourselves or assisting others. Sometimes we might just feel less effective in our roles, and so you might start feeling you can never do enough, so you take on more and become less able to do all those things well. I know one thing that I'm sure Liz has heard me say once or twice is that I feel like I'm operating at about 30% on everything. I'm doing about a 30% job on parenting, about a 30% job on partnering, a 30% job on being a professional, and I don't even know if I'm getting 30% on sleep. So feeling like we're doing none of our responsibilities close to the capacity that we wish that we were, or maybe that we felt like we were before. Maybe your fatigue looks like an inability to embrace complexity. So getting really simple with our thinking, really black and white, and not being able to recognize any nuance that's involved. And that then can look like dismissing the experiences that we hear from folks, or kind of quick categorizing them. And so we might also notice that we're lessening our compassion over time, that we felt like we were pretty compassionate people, but that over time we're doing less and less of that. We might start avoiding trying to understand what people face. That goes along with that really binary thinking, especially during challenging political times. I think we can get into this really binary way of thinking about where people must be at with all the issues, if they're at one place with one of the issues. And overall, we might experience our life satisfaction decreasing. And that this pandemic is really presenting the perfect storm for compassion fatigue. With increased personal and professional demands and less access to our typical supports, we're all experiencing compassion fatigue on some level. I see folks still coming in with responses: less efficient work, multitasking without finishing. I think one of the things we've talked about on our team too is having so many tabs open on your computer, which is sort of representative of how much multitasking we're doing. I mean, I have the parenting tab open. I had a sick pet last week, so I have the pet tab open. I have my work tab open, grocery shopping tab open. So I think that's a good sort of analogy for what our lives look like right now. So let's take a look at this model that was developed to look at the stages of fatigue. If you're not a cat person, you'll have to challenge yourself to picture your dog's faces in these same states. So we're talking a little bit about what these might actually look like. So we don't want to dwell too much on compassion fatigue, yet it's important, and the reason we're spending time on it is we want to acknowledge and validate what you might be feeling right now as a normal reaction to a really complex and overwhelming circumstances that are compounding those usual sources of fatigue we may have already been experiencing. So it's not like these are new. I think the volume's just been turned up on many of them. And we might be revisiting some that we thought we had gotten past professionally or personally as we got maybe more comfortable in our roles. So let's take a look. Let's kind of work around this wheel of stages of fatigue. So first in the zealot phase, that's where we've got the big cat lording over the kittens, right? So here we have an overabundance of that can-do sense. We're committed, involved, and available, ready to problem solve and make a difference. A lot of that sounds good, right? But we might be willing to go the extra mile in an unrealistic way. So along the way, we start to notice that things around us aren't perfect. We can't just herd all the kittens, and that the systems that we're part of may not function the way we want them to. Kind of the idea of best laid plans. And that we might move into that irritability stage where we've got our really irritated cat at about 2 or 3 o'clock on the wheel there. We might start to feel angry and cynical, experience diminished creativity, sadness, feeling helpless or hopeless. We moved from that area where we felt like we could do it to a sense of frustration and cynicism, and our hopefulness starts to wane. And so we are irritated that we can't just carry on the way that we thought we could. So this sense of irritability is exhausting and can get overwhelming and lead us to a natural reaction of withdrawal. We might be overwhelmed by complexity and chronic exhaustion. We might experience physical illness, difficulty empathizing, feeling numb to someone else's pain, or as some of you mentioned, absenteeism, or just doing the bare minimum. Let's see if we can arrive late and leave early, just show up for the minimum. And I think that the zombie stage is when we start to move beyond even withdrawal and put up walls by shedding connections to avoid facing the imperfections and complexity. So now we're going to go it alone, right? The zombies out there on their own, trying to take down the city. We don't need anybody else's help. And that growing isolation as a misguided way of protecting ourselves from the unaddressed realities of work. I can just handle this on my own. I don't need those coworkers anymore or those colleagues to help me out. I've got all the answers. And that we start giving up on the workplace and systems that are supposed to provide supports to us. So we don't normally talk about these stages, and we certainly don't talk about them to shame or blame anyone, but instead to give us a better understanding of where we might be at so we can take appropriate action. And we hope, well, a couple things. First of all, we hope that if you're experiencing any of these, that compassion resilience can help lead us back in the direction of renewal and not lead us to leaving the profession. It's also important to know, just like with stages of change and other theories of behavior change, that you can move in and out of these. You might bounce around from one to the other, might get stuck at one, and then kind of come out of it. So it's not inevitable that one would move from zealot to irritable to withdrawal to zombie. And we might find ourselves in the same situation that we were in before and then bounce back to one of the other stages. So I think that sharing these stages of fatigue with your staff and facilitating discussion about it and using some of these cute pictures can be a good way to acknowledge what staff are experiencing right now. It makes it a little more relatable. And then they may be able to find a sense of universality from the fact that we aren't alone wherever we are within this cycle. So we're going to take a few minutes to look at what this type of and to experience what this type of discussion could look like with staff using our relatable kittens here. So I think Liz is going to help get us into, someone's helping get us into breakout sessions, small groups. I don't remember how many folks we have. We have 86. So if we could get people into groups of 5 or so, that would be great. And what we'll have you do is share your name and your role, and then answer the question, which stage most resonates with you now, like today. And I've definitely heard folks say I've been in a few of these already today. So that might be the case for you. And then share a brief personal or professional example of how that stage looks for you. How were you able to identify which stage you were in? And I think what I'll do is, while we're getting, groups set up, is to try to put some of those in the chat so you can see it. So it's name and role, which stage, and then a brief personal or professional reaction.
And Molly, how much time would you like in breakout?
Let's see, we're at 1:20. I think we can give people, we're going to have to move fairly quickly, and I want to respect, I'm going to be passing to Liz soon. So why don't we give people 3 minutes in that? So we'll have to be kind of quick. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can pop those in the chat, the different stages.
Sounds good. All right, Jenna, let's move in breakouts when we're ready. And we're back.
All right, folks, that was a whirlwind, right? I was just telling Liz the time went really fast for us too. So thank you all for getting into breakouts and spending some time talking about this. I'm about to hand the mic to Liz, and I'm just curious what, if folks have the opportunity to chat and want to just throw in there some of the stages of fatigue that you spent a lot of time on, a lot of your 3 minutes on, just to see what y'all had to say. But with that, I think I'm going to peek at that chat as those stages come in that you spent time on, and Liz is going to take over the microphone, and I'll keep on slides, Liz.
Great, thanks, Molly. Want to head to the next slide? All right, so probably recently, many of you have had, either virtual or in-person reactions with colleagues or students or families, or maybe even in your personal life, where, feeling compassionate towards that person was kind of out of reach. It was a little bit difficult. And maybe that's because of, where you're at in your stage of fatigue. So when this happens, there's a really nice, simple activity that you can try, and it kind of helps you to reframe your perspective on that other person. So we're going to do this right now together. So I want you all to just take a minute to think of a person, either at work or in your personal life, that maybe has been a little difficult for you lately. Your interactions have been difficult. All right, so if you've thought of someone, now I'm just going to go through in the 5 steps. And as I go through, feel free, you can repeat these to yourselves or just listen and think about the person. So the first step is, just like me, this person is seeking happiness in their life. Step 2, just like me, this person is trying to avoid suffering in their life. Step 3, just like me, this person has known sadness, loneliness, and despair. Step 4, just like me, this person is seeking to fulfill their needs. And finally, step 5, just like me, this person is learning about life. So I want you all to just take a second to share your reactions to that activity in the chat box. Maybe just pick 1 or 2 words that kind of sum up your reaction to that activity. All right, so empathy, eye-opening, reminds you of a loving kindness meditation, yep. Oh, giving grace, yeah, empathy, shift of focus, everyone has a story, you're not alone. Oh, may need to post near a computer or phone. Yeah, that would be a great place to have that ready. More grace and forgiveness, helps with perspective. It helps you to pause and just consider somebody else's perspective rather than immediately judge, and help look for commonalities. Yeah, great. So this would be a really great activity that you could share with your staff. Just a simple 5-minute activity to do. Like someone said, you can post it in your work area or on the fridge at home. It's just a really nice reminder to try to take a second to find that empathy in difficult times. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the Compassion Resilience Toolkit. So Molly, if you could, thank you. So the activity that we just completed is an example of the types of activities that you would find in the Compassion Resilience Toolkit. So the toolkit is really meant to be a way for schools to support staff resilience, especially during this difficult time. It's not only focused on building individual resilience, but it's really about building a compassionate staff culture. So the toolkit offers a lot of different pieces. So there's information, there are activities and different resources. And it helps school leadership and staff to kind of gain an understanding of some of the different topics and terms, to recognize and to minimize the experience of compassion fatigue, and to increase compassion resilience perspectives and skills. So really it's about building individuals' ability to have the skills that make them resilient. So things like being able to set appropriate boundaries, or have realistic expectations, or engage in different self-care activities. So this is really helpful for teachers, but it's not just helpful for them, right? This benefits principals, administrators, superintendents, student services staff, coaches, paraprofessionals, anyone working in the school community would really benefit from engaging in this toolkit. Now, we're going to be talking today about the school toolkit, but there are also 2 other toolkits that are part of the whole toolkit, and those are for those in health and human services professions, and then also for parents. So the parent toolkit is relatively new, and that's something I know some schools have thought about using with their families. So that's another thing that you can do. Now, the toolkit is really designed to be flexible, and Molly touched on that a little bit for us earlier. But it's really meant to be a universal approach to compassion resilience. So it's not just about those staff who, we think need it most, who are the most burned out. It's really about creating a whole culture shift in a building. So using the whole toolkit, we typically recommend that it be implemented over a 2-year time frame. And each of the 12 sections can be implemented pretty briefly in about a 30-minute session. And that, includes times for individual reflection and application of the ideas. Or more time can be used for more in-depth learning experiences. That's kind of the cool thing about the toolkit. You can use the agendas that are a part of the toolkit to do a short session, or you can really dig in and engage in a lot more material than is just in the agenda. So it's flexible in that way. All right, let's head to the next slide. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what this toolkit is all about, the first sections are about just creating a shared understanding of some of the ideas around compassion resilience. So, you know, what is compassion resilience? What is compassion fatigue? How do you build resilience? What does compassionate action look like? So that's really about helping folks understand how they can be helpful to others when they're struggling or they're witnessing other people in pain. The second part of the toolkit is really focused on the system and team level strategies. So that is really more about that whole culture shift. So those sections examine things like drivers of compassion fatigue, and we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. It talks about expectations that you set for yourself and for others, compassionate boundary setting, and then also how do you build a positive staff culture? What are some rules or commonalities that you can create to establish that positive staff culture? And then the last section of the toolkit is really focused on building individual resilience skills. So those are sort of the things that you might typically think about when you think about self-care, but also much more, because it focuses on the mind, the spirit, strength, and heart. That's kind of how it's split up within the toolkit. And then the very last section is about building compassionate connections with caregivers. So how you have that empathy and understanding when you're interacting with families. So the toolkit also has an appendix that has a lot of other great information about making change, understanding beliefs and the foundations of people's beliefs, establishing an understanding of stress throughout the career cycle, and then also how to respond compassionately to colleagues' pain. All right, next slide. So if you click into the toolkit, and Molly, could you drop the toolkit address into the chat? So if you click into the toolkit at all, you'll see that there are some different symbols in there, and these are just the different kind of interactive pieces of the toolkit. So there is always an introduction to each section that just kind of gives you a brief overview of what that section will be about. There's an information piece that usually is a PDF that you can send out to staff ahead of time before you might be talking about that particular topic or doing a circle with it. And that really digs in, gives all the necessary background information to understand that topic. There are self-care strategies that are woven throughout the toolkit. There is also a preview of what's next, so it's really helpful to help understand the flow of the toolkit. And then there are some applications and links to other things. So it might be to a blog post or a video or something else that helps to really bring that content to life and make it make more sense. Next slide. So there's also now a COVID-19 supplement to the toolkit, and that touches on 9 different areas from the toolkit that have been identified as really useful during this time. So each of the topics has a video, and that video kind of just discusses that concept and relates it to our current experience. And it gives an example of an activity or a discussion that you could do to help build your own resilience and bolster that skill area. And then there's like a blog post or a write-up of that same information. So even if no one in your district feels ready to facilitate the full toolkit right now, these are really simple entry points for building adult compassion resilience in your buildings. So you could send out the videos or the blog posts each week or month to your staff with a few questions or points to think about. You know, that way you could get folks thinking about and working on these skills without overwhelming with full toolkit implementation. We've, heard from a lot of districts that are kind of that just were recently trained and are kind of getting their feet wet with the toolkit by doing that, sending out those little bits to introduce folks to the ideas. And that's also been a good way to build buy-in. All right, so I am going to pass it back over to Molly.
Thanks, Liz. I'm going to talk a little bit about an example agenda. I'm not sure if we said this when we were kind of talking through the logistics, but these sessions can be and likely will be shorter than our webinar today. So often we're talking about like a 30-minute session. So this is just an example of an agenda that you could use. And obviously, you know, we've been training folks virtually, so it's definitely possible to do that. So the locus of control video on the COVID part of the toolkit that Liz just talked about, it's about 7 minutes long. The drivers of fatigue and resilience activity that we're going to do a quick walkthrough of in just a minute. It's also part of that COVID toolkit that takes about 10 minutes, and then putting it into practice. So doing a staff circle agenda for about 8 minutes. So these are fairly streamlined. I mean, obviously these are topics that you all could talk about for a long period of time, but it's also totally doable to do these in 30 minutes. So I know sometimes when folks see this, they think, oh, how are we ever going to implement it? So it's good to break it down into pieces and to think about doing these over a longer span of time and give folks a chance to let it sink in between. So we're going to talk about one of the activities, locus of control activity, where we look at some of those concepts that we've already talked about today, fatigue and resilience. And so imagine that you're in a small group doing this instead of in a larger virtual group. So I'll have each of you that have some supplies by you try this out. So you'll need a piece of paper and something to write with, or you can just pull up a Word document on your computer. And you can start by thinking about and identifying one aspect of your life that has drastically changed recently. Unfortunately, I think we can all probably identify an area of our life that has drastically changed recently. Or it could be an area where you're feeling a sense of stress or fatigue. Maybe it's working from home, maybe it's having your children home with you, or it might be your fear of COVID-19 or your fear for your loved ones. Maybe it's the stress of trying to support students virtually. I know our district has been calling them scholars, so I currently have 3 scholars home with me. So once you've chosen something, make 2 lists. On the first, left-hand side, list what about this time is leading to your fatigue, worry, or fear. And then your second list will be what's feeding your resilience. So I'll just give folks a couple of minutes to build both of those lists. So one list is what's leading to fatigue, worry, or fear around that area of your life that you're holding in mind. And then what's feeding your resilience on the second list. I'll just give you about 2 minutes individually to do this, and then you'll get another instruction. And you're not turning in your assignment, so there are no silly responses. So feel free to be as honest with yourself about those 2 lists as you can. Just give you 1 more minute. Naturally, we might be more challenged by figuring out what's helping you maintain your resilience. If that's the case, maybe go about your day and come back to this list later when, oh, there's one of my scholars now. So you might have a harder time populating that second column than the first. So let's just another 30 seconds to finish up your lists.
Baba, I'll tell you.
All right, so once you've completed both of those lists and identifies the things around which you have control, or I'm sorry, that's the next step. For each of those lists, underline those responses where you think you have some control, or circle them, and then cross out those where you don't have control. Now, for those items where you feel like you have control under both lists, under both the things that are contributing to your fatigue and those that are contributing to your resilience, I want you to consider that the now remaining list of those that you have under your control. And I'm interested in hearing, and this is a strategy obviously you can use virtually as well. Question number one is, what percentage of time does your team or your small team within a team spend discussing the things they can't control when they're together? So you can just pop a number. So this will be our question one percentage is, what percentage of time do you think you all spend talking about things they are unable to control? I'm not seeing any numbers in the chat. Oh, there we go. I'm seeing some 50s, a 70, an all-time high of 75 so far, 25%, 65, 50. One of you just said too much. A lot of answers are ending up around 50, 30, a lot. All right, so as those slow, now question number two is, what percentage seems healthy for your team? So after Jean's response of 50, I'll look at the numbers for what do you think would be healthy for your team to talk about those things that are out of our control. So all the numbers I'm seeing now are smaller than all the numbers from the first question. That's my summary of the chat room. So we're talking 10%, 5%, 15. Comment that it's good to recognize, but we need to move on. So I think there's some real grace here that we all need some time to talk about things that are out of our control, right? That those are some of our greatest stressors. And so it's reasonable that folks are going to want some colleague support around that. But as I said, all those numbers are lower than the ones before. So one thing you might want to think of if you do this activity with your colleagues is ways that you can identify to your team members that the group has gone over that percentage. I'll share a personal story. It used to be that one of my best friends and I used to talk on the phone a lot, and we get louder and louder and laugh more and more. And her husband would go like this to her as a sign, if you can see my video, that we were getting above the volume level. But you might come up with something else. You might be like, hey, let's turn this positive. So it might be something that you say. It might be a hand signal that you do. I know Liz and I saw one shared on one of the trainings we did where people did the rolling down the drain, water going down the drain thing, like, oh, here we go again. Seems like we're spiraling. So you might want to just find a way to recognize that, or hey, folks, let's keep it at 10% and bring up something more positive. So hopefully what you can take away even from this very short version of this exercise is that we can choose to focus mindfully on the experiences that will increase our resilience, be intentionally grateful for those positive facets of our life, and really notice which of those lists were easier for you to create. And I think naturally it's easier for us to come up with what fatigues us than what refreshes us. And so it needs to be an open list. How can I add to that throughout the day? If something comes up that says, hey, that really took me out of my fatigue, add it to your list. And relatedly, that there are aspects on both lists that are outside of our control that we might attune to less frequently, talk about with others less often, or choose to let go of. So it's likely that there are some aspects of our life that we find fatiguing that we really do have control to let go of and therefore change. So for instance, if I find my new work routine and lack of structure fatiguing, I can create a daily schedule, routine, or process for myself. I know I always say I should put down 3 work things that must get done today and 3 home things that must get done today. There might be more, but at a minimum, if I get those 3 things down, I'll feel like I met my goal. So again, it doesn't have to be a high bar. So if this is an activity that you're interested in facilitating with your staff, we recommend that you're a participant in the activity rather than the facilitator. That way you can really maximize staff willingness to engage. So with all of these, as you're doing them, jump right in and join so you don't create that sort of hierarchy. And it also helps to be cognizant of the power differential between you and your staff and the ways that your participation in activities like these could really prompt more sharing, whereas not participating can lead to people shutting down. So that's just kind of a pro tip on how to make this more successful, particularly if you're in a position of power and the participants are not. So with that, I think it's now my turn to pass back to Liz to finish up our session.
Great, thanks, Molly. So if you could head on to the next slide. So just a few things. If you're thinking about implementing this toolkit in your school or district, a few things to know. So one thing that Rogers in-house, who oversee the toolkit, they will do is they can provide a 2 or 3 hour toolkit overview to your school or district staff, just to kind of assess readiness and help everybody get on board and figure out if this is really, you know, a good thing to invest in at this point. There are also facilitator trainings available. So Molly mentioned we've been doing them virtually since March. These trainings, we've been doing them in 2 hour chunks, 4 different sessions. But, you know, it could look different if it's in person, if we ever get back to in-person training. But all of these things you can access if you email WISE at wisewisconsin.org. They can help you figure that out, or you can reach out to Molly or I. We are always planning more of these, so feel free to reach out and ask if we have any upcoming trainings available, or we'll just make sure to let you know when we do. Otherwise, if you have any questions about implementation or you're not sure how you could approach using the toolkit, always feel free to reach out to myself or Molly. Otherwise, the folks at Rogers, they have done a lot of this. They've done a lot of implementation with a lot of different schools. They're really, really great resources to reach out to as well. All right, so one last slide before we move to questions and then, you know, off onto another part of our day. Just take a minute to just ground yourself. So this is from De-Stress Monday, which is a really cool website. They have all of these different GIFs of moving shapes or different breaks you can take or different meditations that you can do. It's just to help you with your compassion resilience. So I'll just stop talking for a minute and let you focus on the shape, and then we'll turn it back over to Joe.
And one more deep breath, everybody. Thank you very much, Molly and Liz. Really appreciate that. So again, I want to invite people to raise questions to the chat. I'm going to get us started here. I know we have a few minutes, so I don't want to lose the opportunity. So, and I'm not sure whoever wants to address this, please, Molly or Liz, just hop right in. But you had mentioned often this is, where people will do this. Think of it like a 2-year effort to try to build the culture around compassion resilience. I'm just curious about, you have here, 70 or so school leaders and system leaders who think very they have to start thinking 2 years, like, okay, how much time do I have to allocate? Because time's such a valuable resource, et cetera. So that'd be like I think like that half-hour segment example agenda you shared, like I do that monthly for 2 years. And at some point we'd be definitely making some big progress. If I could make a half an hour commitment once a month, or is there some other sort of allotment of time and energy that you see is really necessary to see the shift in the culture?
Yeah, so that's a great question. A lot of schools have approached it with using, just like you said, about a 30 to 45-minute chunk. It might be during a staff meeting. Usually it's monthly. Monthly seems to be a pretty good pace because it gives folks enough time to kind of digest the material, start trying some of it out, have time for questions to come up and things like that. So that's the pace that a lot of schools have found to be pretty successful for them. Of course, if you wanted to take more time, you could do more things in between those circle agendas. So if you have those touch bases every month, but you could have more frequent interactions around it as well. But I would say the very minimum would be that sort of monthly pace.
And then I was intrigued by the COVID toolkit supplement you shared. I wasn't aware of that till today. I've certainly seen the rest of the toolkit before and worked in a good number of parts of it. So now that that's here, and obviously that gets our attention, it's been maybe updated or particularly relevant, I think is Molly, how you described it. So how might that COVID toolkit, would I go there first before I go to the overall toolkit if I'm a principal trying to work with this with my teachers? Is that what you might suggest?
Yeah, I can start on that one, and then Liz, if you want to add. I mean, I think that's a good place to start because it's a good kind of a hook for people because it is so relevant to what's going on right now. So, I mean, I could see using a couple of those videos just to warm people up to the idea of compassion resilience because it is so relevant to the pandemic. Liz, I don't know if you had other ideas.
No, I would say the same thing. I think that's a really good place to start, especially right now. I think for people to think about taking on the whole toolkit right now is pretty overwhelming. So just in the very near future, and until you could really start that process, that would be a really good place to start.
Yeah, and just so, with your permission, Molly and Liz, we'll include with the recording of this session tomorrow. I'll also include the slide deck so people can return back to some of that. But I particularly liked that example you had that kind of integrated one of the COVID videos plus a couple, an activity and et cetera. Is there somewhere on the toolkit or within the COVID resources where people see other examples of that, where someone like you that has background in training or just the time to actually thoughtfully think about how you might have a kind of a video plus an activity plus an application, kind of a plan just they could put in place?
Yeah, I feel like there are sample agendas in there that were there prior to the COVID toolkit page, so that folks can kind of plan on how to set them up, that there's sort of a stock template
Sure.
that they can plug into. And I think some of that came through in the slide that Liz presented on the parts that are present in each session. And you can kind of pick and choose based on time. But I mean, Liz and I both have done a lot of facilitating, and I'm a big believer that you need engaging activity, obviously, in addition to just talking to folks, and those are integrated into each session. Some of the examples like we did today.
Right, there was that slide that you shared, and maybe I'm just going to quick show it here. I got a couple minutes left, just because I want to make sure we're all tracking what I'm trying to ask. And that was what you just had brought up. So hopefully y'all can see my screen.
Yep.
Great. Okay. So the slide that I had was that was this one here where you had the toolkit in the different sections. And so I'm just looking at who's here in our audience today. And we have a lot of school leaders, but we also have a number of system leaders. And so I'm just kind of wondering, if I'm a school leader and my focus is really trying to help my teachers develop compassion, resilience, and my school culture, of course, am I more working in sections 1 through 3 and 8 through 12, whereas maybe a system-wide thing, we're really particularly in this part as well, the middle section? Is that a distinction you see as people with kind of a deeper background than most of the people on the webinar?
I'm trying to think, Liz, my sense of why they set it up this way was that they didn't want to kind of come busting in with self-care skills and, not recognize that people were experiencing fatigue. So I think that was some of the thought process behind putting the self-care skills toward the end, is so that people could become, compassionate to their own fatigue before the self-care skills. So I think sections 1 through 3 are key. I think where you go beyond that is probably up to the situation, like you said, but I would definitely say start with 1 through 3.
That's helpful. And last question then, unless there's something else that pops up in the chat. So obviously there is a culture you're trying to create. I'm curious about whether, do you see places that make these shifts, schools and systems? Is this ultimately something that you see teachers sharing with students, and is that part of the goal? Whereas, for example, I know someone that that kind of activity we did earlier today would, translate into an actual, maybe developmentally appropriate version of that in a classroom with students.
So I don't know any districts or schools that have adapted it for use with students, although I can see, like you pointed out, there are a lot of things in there that would be very useful to share with students. So I certainly think you could adapt some of it and share it as appropriate.
I mean, that just like me activity, frankly, I could see using it with my own kids in my house, just thinking of somebody they've had a challenge with, and maybe changing the language so it's a little more relatable for a elementary aged kid to think about someone else, like just like me, they're trying hard, just like me, they're struggling with the pandemic, just like me, it might change it up a little bit, but I could see that being a really useful activity for younger kids too.
Well, thank you so much. So again, I want to, on behalf of everyone here, thank you, Molly, thank you, Liz, for this really important stuff that you are, resources and approaches that you're sharing with us today. So it really meets a huge need. We know it, it's not going away. And I love the idea of compassion resilience being this reservoir of well-being. It's something we all need to tend to. And it wasn't even language we had 5-10 years ago in this world. So it's that the language of compassion, resilience, and self-care and all these concepts is, to me, the biggest indicator that we have, a need for this time, particularly, that we need to tend to as leaders. And so I just thank everyone for learning about it, growing in it. And I also, as we close, again, want to remind you that we do have the recording and slides will go out within 24 hours. If you were a person who signed up for this webinar, or if you have a friend in the district who couldn't make it because of another conflict that was unanticipated today, just know they'll be getting that from Jenna here within 24 hours. I also want to remind you, as I scroll down here, this is part of a series, session 2. And so again, if you're interested in more about this, you can find on our website our mental health and resilience webinar series in partnership with good people like Molly and Liz from DPI. The next session will be on November 12th, which is really looking at another pillar of the Wisconsin mental health framework, which is around trauma sensitive work, and particularly thinking about how that may or may not be integrated into your system and what you might want to do around that. So again, the series continues. We're glad you could join us today. God bless you all and be well. And thanks for what you do to make a better school and state for our students and our communities. Till next time, be well.